I want to be like clear, because a lot of people think like, oh, can you tell us what you did? How did you do this and all that? And it's like, it's a lot more fundamental than like a quick hack or a quick optimization. It is fundamentally a new way to render vector graphics that the team has come up with.
There's a newish tool in town that I've become kind of obsessed with this year, and it's called Rive. If you're unfamiliar, Rive is in some ways the spiritual successor to Flash, an animation tool that can build and ship very detailed interactive experiences with many layers of animation. If you know After Effects, you can pick it up very quickly. And I believe Rive is poised to absolutely dominate the interaction design space. And so I asked the CEO and co-founder of the company, Guido Rosso, to come on the podcast to tell us all about the app, the company, the use cases, and the future of the tool. Rive is already being used at some pretty high-profile companies like Figma and Duolingo, and the capabilities it brings are pretty amazing if you do any kind of work for digital products, websites, interactive installations, or anything along those lines. If you're familiar with Rive, this conversation is going to get you very fired up about the future of this tool, and frankly, of motion design as a tool set that can be deployed in a lot of interesting ways. And if this is your first introduction to Rive, leave a comment after you listen to this and tell me what you think. All right, let's meet Guido. Guido, it is so awesome to talk to you. I've been following you online. I've been using Rive. I've been talking about Rive, and I know we've emailed back and forth a few times, but I never got to hear your voice until today. So thank you for doing this, man.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks, Joey. It was great to have you on. I was trying to remember, like, have we not chatted before? Because you sound so familiar to me, and I'm so used to seeing you on YouTube, and yeah, it felt like we'd already spoken before, but yeah, I guess not.
Yeah, I do get that a lot. Awesome. So I've been talking about Rive at School of Motion for a while. I've mentioned it on other podcasts, and we've done tutorial about it. And our audience clearly knows about it. But just in case someone's watching this and they don't actually know what Rive is, and I'm sure you've practiced this because you've had to raise money to do Rive. What's the elevator pitch? What is Rive?
Sure. So it's fundamentally a design tool that helps you build graphics that are ready to ship. And the most immediate thing that resonates with people is that it's got a lot of animation, and everything is sort of interactive and animated. It looks really smooth. It's 60 frames per second, depending on your device, can even be 120 frames per second. So it's just very fluid and immediately eye-catching, and so I think that's, people gravitate towards the animation side of it and think of it as an animation first tool. But really, we're trying to change a bit how people think about designing graphics that are meant to ship in products.
Got it. Okay. I mean, I've seen a lot of attempts to sort of solve the problem I think Rive is trying to solve. Years ago, I had the founder of an app called Haiku come on, and it was kind of the same idea, right? That like motion designers know how to design and animate, but then, so you could design a button that looks really cool, but wouldn't it be cool if when you hovered over it, something interesting happened? And the tools to do that have, except for Flash, really was the only one that I think actually had like a kind of a good model for it. So is that kind of what Rive is aiming at? Is that sort of interactive in animation, really?
Definitely. It definitely has evolved to that. We didn't start like that. It's funny, but we, as throughout the years of evolving and building it, we realized, it kind of dawned upon me and my co-founder, who've worked together for some maybe 25 years now as designer and dev duo. Like I'm the design side, he's the engineer. And it dawned on us as we were building this other product that Rive had started as, that like all these old customers were reaching out and saying like someone from Google reached out and said we had worked with him previously when he was at Microsoft. We were doing some projects for Xbox, and now he's at Google, and he was telling us, we tried to do like this animated, the Google Assistant, when it like transforms into like some balls and it's rotating, and then it morphs into the G logo, and then it morphs into a microphone. It's doing all these animations, and he was telling us like, that took us months to like actually implement, and we still don't have it the way the designers want it. And they just built like a bunch of After Effects files and kind of handed us off like, this is what it's supposed to do. But when we went to build it, we realized, well, it can morph from any moment into this shape and that shape. So there's all these like permutations that aren't captured in the After Effects videos. And so it took us a really long back and forth to like make sure it was right. And again, it still doesn't feel right. And so that was kind of like where it clicked for us, like, oh, we've been building this tool that was at the time had been for character animation. My co-founder and I had kind of wanted to go back to our roots, which had started in gaming. And we were like, okay, we're gonna do like online character animation software, because it was something that we had needed for a hobby project that we had done a few years earlier. And yeah, it just dawned on us that like, oh, there's like all these folks that still need this thing that Flash gave them a glimpse of what it could be, but then had all these other issues that in many ways it was right that Flash needed to go away because of the way that, you know, some of the limitations that it had and some of the security concerns, all things that were valid. But like kind of what you were getting at, what went away with Flash was this ability for designers to really, for creatives really, it doesn't have to be a designer. It can be anyone who's got like a creative vision to build something that is the thing that ships, right? And they're not limited by, you know, certain things that, you know, a framework can allow them to do. And it's a lot more open and creative and lets you build whatever you want, knowing that it's actually going to work. And yeah, that's a lot of what kind of clicked for us when we heard that, you know, these customers coming back to us and telling us, like, seeing what we were doing, like, oh, could you help us with this? Could you help us with that? And that's when we, sort of realized, okay, we got to make this a lot more of a design tool than just a character animation tool.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of concepts, and like I think that example you gave is perfect because, you know, everyone, even if you're just listening to this podcast, you're not watching it, you could probably imagine, like, you know, 4 Google colored little dots kind of, you know, moving around randomly, wiggling, and they could be in any position at the moment the user does something, where now they need to animate a certain way. And so you can't just have keyframes. You need the animation literally to react at that moment and you know, interpolate correctly. And that's a really tricky technical challenge to solve, you know, and in the past, doing it in After Effects and then trying to somehow have a Rosetta Stone or translate somehow to what the software developer needs. Super tricky.
Yeah, it was often something that just got handed off to the developer. You figure it out, you know, and then iterate. Like the designers would come back like, no, that's not what it should look like. It should look like this. And it created all this back and forth. But, you know, a lot of the times also it was sort of like, well, we got it working. We're not going to go and, you know, do it again. You know, open up a ticket and, you know, document what's not working, and we'll get back to it when we have time for it. And instead, we fundamentally believe that all of that belongs in the designer's hand. Like if the designer has a tool that has a state machine that lets them interpolate at any moment and blend animations together, they're in control of that, and the dev side doesn't even need to be aware of what's happening.
Right. So later on, I want to get into, because there is a handoff point where like a motion designer can act as an interaction designer, which is kind of the term that popped into my head when you were describing this. But then at some point, there needs to be like a message sent from that button that was clicked to the software that's actually then going to do something more complicated. And I'm curious how you guys are approaching that. But I'm really curious, like, why did you decide to build this? You know, I know you have a twin brother, Luigi, and you guys are working on this together.
Yeah.
Did you have some experience like previous to Rive that made you realize, oh, this is like a big hole, or did you just kind of stumble upon this, you know, this need?
So definitely, so the two of us have been working together for like I said, some 25 years. We started, we were still in high school in Malaysia. We were living in Kuala Lumpur at the time.
Oh, wow. Cool.
Yeah, we kind of lived all over the world thanks to what our parents were doing when we were kids. And went to international schools, by the way, which is why I don't sound Italian. But it is my first language.
Do your parents do they sound Italian?
Oh, yeah.
Like, Italian? Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And I still have an Italian passport. I'm going to get my US passport at some point. I qualify for it now. But yeah, so we've been working for a really long time, and we had started, like, I think it was like maybe 99 or 2000 when we started our first company, and it was really doing like services like Flash and HTML for companies that wanted, you know, a lot of like really interactive. They wanted their brand to be different, and like Flash was just starting to take off, and it was like this really cool moment in the web where suddenly every brand had like a really unique look. And in some ways we've kind of gone backwards from that now, where everyone kind of has to fall more into these cookie cutter templates. And so yeah, we've worked for since then. We've had multiple startups together. We moved to Italy for college, where our company was doing really well, and ended up merging with a company in San Francisco. And that's when we moved to the US. And then in San Francisco, we ended up starting our own design build agency where we were working for Adobe. Actually, it was Macromedia initially. We did some of the very first Flash stuff, like the Flash, I believe it was, I'm not going to say it right now. It was one of the Flash Professional 6, maybe, where they came out with the components that shipped in Flash. You know, they had like drop down menus and pre-made scroll bars. So our team built those. Our names are still in the credits to this day of Adobe Animate.
Oh, cool.
And anyway, we were building. Yeah, we got a lot of customers that came to us to build stuff that had a lot of motion and a lot of interactivity, but was also really functional. So we did stuff for like Xbox and the first 360 third-party apps, Xbox 360. We worked with companies like Netflix and MLB and HBO, Red Bull. We did their first HTML5 site. So the point is, we've had like this pretty long career of working on high impact, high entertainment, lots of mixed media stuff, and always felt like, after Flash went away, that like nothing quite like gave designers like me, who does a little bit of coding, the ability to be dangerous, right? To sort of be able to animate and make things look the way you want it, but then also add just enough interactivity, just enough of like, you can just really handle all the front end without having to do the more complicated back end stuff that then you hand off to like my twin, and he handles what that does. So long story here. We ended up selling that company to Intel, and after working for a couple of years on a project at Intel that then ended up getting acquired by someone else, it kind of freed us to go and do our next thing. And we really came across this idea of like, there's this lack of tooling still to create stuff that makes the designers lead the interactivity. And we started with character animation because we have a background in gaming. Back in 99, 98, my twin was making one of the first Quake 2 mods. If you played any Quake 2 mods, awesome. he made like one of the homing rockets that everyone used in that game. And since we'd always been in gaming, and so we started like with this character animation platform, and that slowly evolved to where we are today. And so I've talked a lot, but that's a backstory of like where this all came from. And we definitely we started building the tools for us, is the way to say. We needed this tool. And we felt like it was a hole. And then as we started using it ourselves, old customers started coming and saying like, hey, we need this,
Yeah. So, one of the designers that I've been talking to recently is Jerry Liu, who you guys just hired recently as a creative director, amazing animator. And he's been posting some Rive sort of experiments he's been doing where he's building basically game UIs. And they look really cool, and they're sort of like reminiscent of like 80s and 90s video games and stuff like that. Was that the kind of stuff that you and your brother have worked on in the past? And I'm curious, if so, what was it like? What did you have to do back then to build those things?
Oh, yeah. Sure.
I can imagine like you could design them, you could animate them, but then there's this missing piece of like, okay, when the user pushes this happens, and there was no way to do that except for Flash, the only one I knew of.
That's right. Yeah. So with Flash, I would build the stuff directly in Flash and know that it was going to work. And I could iterate on stuff and come up with really cool menus that slid and had sound effects and just weren't your classic drop down or pop up, and you could really iterate on it and come up with. I remember one site we did this really reverse sort of, instead of a drop down as a drop up menu, but it slid and did all this crazy stuff, or like a radial kind of circular menu instead of a drop down. And it just like, I could iterate on that and figure out how to make it work. And then suddenly, when that went away, we started working with other tools like HTML5, and like we worked a lot with Microsoft. So there was a lot of Silverlight work. We did a lot of Windows Phone work, the very first like Windows Phone mobile apps and stuff like that. We worked on the Associated Press for Windows Phone, which was, I believe, the first third-party app that went on the Windows Phone, and that was like me mostly doing mockups in After Effects and maybe Photoshop, and not at all a runtime format, like just kind of coming up with crazy ideas and then going and sitting with Luigi and our devs and figuring out like, okay, how are we going to build this? And the cool thing there was that it sort of allowed, because we had such a strong dev team, it allowed us to be crazy creative and come up with things that we weren't locking ourselves into what like sort of the frameworks we're doing. But oftentimes we needed to go and then kind of compromise because there was things that you just flat out couldn't do. Right. And so it was tedious, it was laborious, and it never ended up being exactly what we wanted it to be. There was always some compromise, but it was a big learning process and a big sort of, it left us feeling kind of confirming like we need better tools for this.
So, I interviewed years ago two guys that had worked at Airbnb and were part of the team that helped develop Lottie, the original version of it. Yeah. And I remember thinking at that point, oh, this is great because this is clearly solving a problem. And this was, still when like, mobile apps, would go in the app store and be number one in millions of downloads. And all of a sudden you'd start to see some interesting interaction design happening. And up until that point, I never actually worked on that stuff professionally. I sort of ended my client career before that stuff was really happening. But what I was told was exactly what you just described. You'd have a designer and an animator that would kind of almost concept what this should do. And then you'd work with a developer that hopefully could implement it somewhat faithfully. Yeah. And sometimes it was, dependent on their skill and how much time they had, all these things. Lottie was, the promise of Lottie, I thought, was always it kind of translates the After Effects animation into code. And so now you're kind of building this bridge. So is Rive doing something similar? Like, what are the differences between Lottie, which I'm sure everyone listening knows about, and Rive, which is newer?
Yeah. So I think some of the fundamental differences are just that like After Effects was never meant to build layouts or interactivity, right? So the concept of mixing animations, which is very common in game engines, and if you go to our website and look at some of like the buttons that you can hover there, and like some of the stuff we were talking about, like the infinite permutations, you can hover and hover off at any moment. You don't have to wait for like a certain animation to stop playing. It's a lot more like a video game where a run cycle can transform into a walk cycle, and it can blend into any of those in between. Yeah. After Effects just doesn't have a concept of that. You can make a walk cycle and a run cycle, but then if you want to do an in-between of those cycles, you got to go animate another version of that. You
can't have some super elaborate expression maybe could do it, but yeah, it'd be a pain in the ass, yeah.
And you're still not going to, be able to like really, what's it called? Like really play that back in real time and morph those things as it's happening.
Right.
So
it's not runtime. Yeah.
After Effects itself just isn't, number one, just built for that kind of concept of and layout and building out like full blown layouts in there. But it's also the fact that the format that After Effects has, it was never intended to be a runtime format. So it's very verbose. It has a lot of stuff in there that just is meant to be. Lottie is basically a what's it called, like an export of the After Effects format. And they do a good job like optimizing and cleaning some stuff up. But at the end of the day, it was never really designed to be something that's meant to run in software. And so I think that those are some of the things that it's challenged by. It's sort of creating a runtime for something that was never meant to produce runtime content. And that's why I think like maybe one way to think about it is sort of like the Apple way of doing things, or like maybe Ferrari on Formula One, where, maybe Ferrari's not a great example. They're not doing so great right now. But when I was a kid watching Ferrari in Formula One, It felt like this, where they kind of have the vertically integrated stack, right? Where they build the engine, they build the chassis, they build like, they just, everything is meant for the whole thing. And that's Apple, right? Apple builds the hardware and the software. And that's kind of what we're trying to do with Rive, where the editor, the format first and foremost is built for runtime, and the editor is built on that format. And then we have a renderer that's built for all of that. And our runtimes, again, it's all like this vertically integrated thing that is purpose built.
Got it. So do you see Lottie? It's funny. So we put out this tutorial about Rive, and I sort of showed the very basic example. Here's a button, and then you can create another timeline for what happens when you hover, and then you can use the state machine and blend them and all these things. And our thumbnail that we put on YouTube said, Lottie can't do this. It was, like we're trying to get clicks, right? And I actually got some pushback from some of the animators in our community who they kind of took offense to it. And it kind of surprised me. I thought, I was just sort of pointing out, literally, Lottie can't do this.
Yeah.
And they were like, no, you can. You can hack it and do it this way. And it seemed like there's almost like there's Lottie fans, there's Rive fans. Does it feel like there's a little bit of a competitive thing between these two things?
I think so, but we don't really see it that way. We were actually trying not to talk too much about Lottie initially, because we always felt like Lottie was a great solution in a time where Flash was gone and there wasn't a way for animators to just like really get motion graphics into software. And I think it still was like a really great solution for that. It's great for icons and illustrations, but we've always seen it as, what Flash does really well is that they let you create experiences. And that's what we're trying to get to with Rive. And that's what I think why we were kind of avoiding it was, talking about the comparison between Lottie and Rive, where people right now are sort of using Rive to make icons and some onboarding animations. So there's some competitiveness. But ultimately what you'll be able to do with Rive, you just can't do with After Effects or the Lottie format. And so we kind of tried to avoid it and because we didn't want to create this, like, we think there's room for both. And there's still, like, if you're still trying to get, a simple animated icon and After Effects is your tool and you love it, and you don't really need it to be interactive. You just need it to like sort of animate when you maybe one interaction, but like you hover and that's it. Then you probably don't need Rive just for that. Although there's other reasons why I think the Rive format is more optimized, and that's where we get into the conversations that I think stirred the pot a little bit about like, oh, Rive is smaller, Rive is more efficient and all that. And That's true, but that's also because we designed the format for this initially, whereas Lottie was kind of taking an After Effects format that was never intended to run on a website or run in software. And so, yeah, to answer your question, it does feel like there's been some competitiveness there, but I think once we kind of establish more of our place as something that helps you do a lot more than just, these kind of smaller animated vignettes or icons or kind of onboarding animations, it'll be clear that the tool is just solving a much bigger problem.
Right. Yeah. And I want to talk about some of those, like the technical differences aside from just the use cases. But I think to me, and I'm curious if you'd agree with this, to me, the biggest difference between the two things is the concept of the state machine that Rive has. There's nothing like that in After Effects.
Yeah.
And frankly, there's actually quite a few tools now. I just heard of another one the other day. I met a founder who's building another tool on top of the Lottie sort of format.
Yeah,
and it's right, and there's a lot of those. But most of those still don't have this concept of anything like the state machine, where you can, as the animator, build and prototype and test and then ship interaction, right? So I was trying to think of how to explain, especially to the people who are just listening to this, what the state machine is. I'm sure you could do a better job. So maybe you could just kind of walk us through what is the state machine? What's it for? How's it work?
Yeah, this is the brainchild of my twin, my co-founder. Like, he's been saying this since we were in high school together. Gonna date myself here, but I think I already did earlier. So like 20 years ago plus, 20 plus years ago. And he said all along that like what he ends up doing like over and over again when I build some graphics and he has to go and like implement it, is he ends up writing state machines. And it's one of the things that probably every developer at some point has done. And it's something that we've seen, like Unity has a really great state machine. I think that was an acquisition that came in from Mechanim, I believe, was the initial product that was like an add-on to Unity, and then they bought it and integrated it. And it's sort of like the only tool for the long time anyway that has some design component to it, because I wouldn't call Unity a design tool, but that gives you a visual state machine. And so yeah, that's let's start there. It's a visual state machine. It's a visual graph. It's a chart that lets you basically take your animations, timelines, and place them on a graph and then draw connections between them. And then your state machine has certain inputs, which is data. It can be numbers. It can be like a Boolean, like true or false. It can be, we have various ones. We have a trigger, which is basically just like it's a Boolean that automatically sets itself to false. But anyway, there's these different inputs that can come into the state machine, and the state machine reacts. So it might start, like your state machine might start with an idle pose, and it's just looping on this idle animation. And you just make it start like that. Then some input might happen, like, you might tell it like, hey, this region was hovered, or some data came in, and you can tell your state machine, okay, when that happens, trigger this other animation, or maybe blend these other two animations together. Like maybe my speed, I might have a speed input, and I'm currently looping on the walk animation, but I've got also this like kind of run animation on top of it. And currently my speed is set to, 1, so it's walking, but then the speed goes up to 2, and it starts blending between that run and walk animation. So anyway, point is, it's a visual way for designers to sort of connect different animations together and mix them together and do it in a way where you actually see it happening and you can iterate on it and test it out all in one environment in real time.
Yeah, that's a really good explanation. And I, it's funny, I think that sort of fighting game, like, use case, it makes a lot of sense. And even simpler things like having a button, you can have a button that's sort of pulsating, and then doesn't matter what frame the mouse moves over it, as the pulsating will continue, but it will grow 10%.
Yeah. I started with a character side because that's where the product started, and that's I think that's a good example of characters. What we're like in a game engine, like we were saying, like, you might want to have a character that's like walking, but then maybe pointing and shooting, and in After Effects, if you were doing something like that, you have to make all the different permutations of like, well, here's what it looks like when it shoots and walks. Here's what it looks like when it's swimming and shooting. And in Rive, you would just make a character that has, the kind of in a state machine, you would make the character sort of either walk, the legs are either walking, running, or swimming, and then the arms can shoot, and you can blend that shoot animation on top. And same thing with a button, like you're saying, you can have a button that starts with sort of a idle state, then it has a hovered state, and then it might have a disabled state. It might have like a processing state with a spinner, and it's sort of doing some stuff. And on top of that, you can have these sort of we call them layers, but they're also kind of nested animation. So you could have like when it's on the idle state, like you're saying, you could have a pulsating glow that's got maybe that's 1 second long and that's looping there. But then you've got like, I don't know, like the spinner that's like a different like 3 seconds long, and those can be kind of looping on top of each other independently. And in the state machine, you can connect that all up so that you don't have to try to figure out mathematically how am I going to make this all fit on one timeline and subdivide it in a way that makes sense.
Yeah. It's fascinating, and I've watched as you add more features too. And I just had a conversation about this. I think that motion designers, at least, and maybe this is my bias, just because we're probably around the same age. I graduated high school in 1999.
Yeah, 2000, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm used to thinking about sort of linear time with animation. And so there's concepts that as I picked up Rive, and I've also gotten into development. I use this tool called Bubble, and I've built a tool with that. And so I've become familiar with these concepts. You've got functions, and you've got listeners, and you've got events, and Rive has all of that built into it. I saw recently you added the ability to sort of pipe in text from, I assume, like a website or an app or whatever, and you've built tools so that like the thing, the animation can react to the text, and you can animate things and it will adapt and all that. So how, like right now, Rive, you're adding features all the time. And I could imagine that, if you fast forward 10 years, this becomes a very complicated, deep technical tool to use. I'm curious if you have any sort of vision for how simple you want to try to keep it so that, because you could always skew too far to developers versus, artists.
Yeah. No, so we fundamentally, the way we think about it is we are a creative tool first, a visual tool first. So we want it to be for designers. That said, we are planning on adding some type of scripting to the tool, because that was, I think, what made Flash really great too, was the fact that you could do a little bit of scripting if you wanted to, or you could do a lot of scripting, and that kind of, it started blurring the line between what a designer and a developer is, sort of like what After Effects with expressions lets you do. But imagine being able to do that with, runtime content, as you're playing the state machine, it's interacting and you're seeing different things happening. So yeah, to answer your question, I think we will add, more features, and it will get more powerful. But we always try to strike that balance. Having like co-founder, designer, and dev, we're always like making sure that it fits that persona, right? The persona that is really creative and just wants to build something and make it functional. And if they are a low-level engineer and they want to code the hell out of it, they can go for it. But you don't need to. You can do a lot of that, in the editor itself, in easier to use tools, and that's like something we always want to keep. I will say that I think a really interesting thing that Rive can do is that because what you're building is actually, a functional format, we like the idea of helping, designers that might have never touched code level up a bit, because the concepts that they're going to learn in a tool like this are concepts that work in anything. It's not like you're learning just how to do prototyping in this specific tool. I think that's one of the downfalls of like prototyping tools, is that ultimately it's all their kind of sandbox and they're closed off, walled garden, and the concepts you learn there, some of them will carry over, but a lot of them tend to be like, I'm learning how to use just this tool. Whereas with Rive, what we try to do is really help people learn like real world coding practices and how you actually build. Like what we don't want is for an engineer to look at this and say like, oh, look at what this spat out. This is crap. This is not how you would properly build this. Instead, we're taking away the stuff that we think engineers don't want to be doing, like building state machines and making it visual. Yeah, so that's all to say that there will be more complexity, but it'll be a skill that once you've learned it, it makes you a more skilled creative in general. It's not something that's just, blocks you into the Rive way of doing things.
Yeah, well, especially with the type of work that seems to be like exploding right now. Like the world of advertising dollars, being spent on motion design, like that world is always going to exist. But I think it's shrinking just because everything's being so spread out, and like brands are spending money on TikTok influencers and stuff like that. But product teams seem to really be, grasping in a way that they haven't up until recently, that animation is a really powerful tool for user experience.
Yeah.
And so Rive also probably like is coming along at a really good time for that, right?
We talk a lot about this internally, and you might have seen us pushing a lot on the game stuff recently, and that's very related to this conversation. Like we have some really amazing product companies working with Rive that some of them we can't talk about publicly yet, but Duolingo is one that has, championed Rive a lot. They've been champions for us, and now they're turning into, the other way around, where like they're presenting us to their customers, sort of, and which is I thought really interesting. We didn't know they were going to do that at DuoCon earlier this week. They had this conference where they kind of present like to their end user, their end customer, who isn't a designer or a developer. The people who use Duolingo are just, they're just end users of the product. And it was really cool to see them spend a solid 10 minutes talking about Rive. And so I think that's a good signal that they really do love the tool. And there are these product teams that are staffing up animators specifically for this. But we are at sort of an inflection point, or at they're still growing to do there. I think, like, if you look at product teams, I would probably say that the majority today don't have a dedicated motion person working on the product. Some do, like Duolingo clearly does. Figma clearly does. They shipped a bunch of.
I know Google does a lot too. Yeah. Google. Yeah,
Doodle does too. Google, sorry, does too. Yeah, Doodles is a customer. I thought you said Doodle, but you Googled. Yeah. I don't know if you've seen some of the stuff Doodles is doing with Rive is really cool. But it's not like universal yet, right? It's starting to get there. And I think that's something, going back to the Lottie thing, I think that is what is appealing about Lottie, is that there's just a lot of After Effects animators. And so there's a lot of stuff that folks that don't have a team, that are sort of indie devs and just want to go and get like a quick button or a quick animated icon, there's a lot of that Lottie stuff out there that you can use. But product teams that are trying to build something custom the way Duolingo is, and really like representative of their brand, that shift is happening, but we think it's going to take some time for like everybody to suddenly be, doing that. And so, and that's really why instead we see kind of the game dev side right now, and with Rive's new UI tools and the text we were talking about, there's this really big hole in game UI. There's no tool there. There's no, or at least there's a lot of tools, but there's no one that really does the full pipeline the way that Rive does. And so, and they all have, animators on staff. And so we see that as like an immediate path for us to sort of become the leader of that sort of category. And then, work with these really cool companies like Duolingo, like Figma, like some of the ones that I wish I could say that I can't share yet, but are starting to do some really cool stuff with Rive. And when you start seeing these big companies, and what they're doing with it, it'll sort of be an aha moment and help people realize like, oh, we can make products that are really different and unique and have like the brand is like really shines through as this, it doesn't look like just your typical, Android or iOS app.
Yeah, Duolingo is a great example because, I know enough now about development stuff to realize what a challenge it would be to do what they're doing with character animation inside of their app with another tool. I think if it was, their look is 2D and cute and cartoony, right? And so maybe you could do this kind of thing with Unity and, have developers like sort of build something like that there and have a state machine and lip sync and all these things. But otherwise, you'd have to have a ton of custom code driving all of it.
That's right.
And I'm sure they do, but having seen some of the breakdowns and stuff, I know the Gunner guys too. So I mean, they also have like amazing talent, working on this stuff, right? It's hard to imagine doing something like that in a straightforward way without a tool like Rive. And I was curious about this because when I first started using Rive, it didn't have a text tool, but it had this amazing bone system and a meshing system for doing character animation. And to me, that seemed like, well, that's interesting. Why do they have this pretty robust character animation thing in there and you can't put type in it yet? Yeah. And I was wondering if that was being driven by the kinds of customers you were having or if there's some other reason.
No, there was another reason. It was fortunate that we were there because I think that's why Duolingo was such an early adopter, is I just happened to have all the things that they really needed early on. But yeah, so after we sold our company to Intel, our agency that was doing kind of like really interactive design build services, my co-founder and I went back to wanting to do games, like where we had started. And we started building some games on the side. And we realized that our games did actually pretty well. Like we got on the top list of the App Store. Two of our games got featured, but they went into Apple commercials. It was really awesome, but they made no money. We had no idea about like how to monetize and do that type of thing with games. And so we're just like your classic individual contributor, designer, dev that just wants to build something really cool and then like no idea how to monetize it.
Right.
And so it did really well, but like what we quickly realized instead of doing that was that the tools we were building to make those games were actually sparking the most interest. Like people would see us doing something like maybe creating a level in a browser. And they were like, well, what are you doing there? What's that? Like, oh, this is the tool we built to like create the level and like edit it. And that's where it like kind of clicked like, oh, maybe, there's other people that want to use this tool. And that's a little bit better. Games can be lightning in a bottle. How do you make it successful? And instead, like a tool is like, well, that's something we've done our whole lives. We know tools really well. And so, yeah, that's where it started. And because of that kind of those games that we were building at the time, those very much inspired and informed some of the first features that we were going to build because those were top of mind for us and the things that we had needed when we were doing that. And there was like 2D characters, bones, and all that. And it wasn't until that Google thing I mentioned earlier that someone came to us and said like, oh my gosh, this tool looks amazing. Can you help us? We've been struggling with After Effects, that we really clicked like, oh, we literally have everything here that you need to be like the next version of Flash. We're missing, we didn't have vector graphics at the time. We didn't have text and like some of the layout stuff that you'd need for that. But we immediately saw that path, and that was sort of the aha moment. Like, okay, this is what this company is going to be.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the technical innovations, because I think like so far we've been focusing more on like the mental model that you take into Rive, right? To use the state machine and build multiple timelines and things like this. But you mentioned earlier that there's other considerations, right? And so like I think an obvious one is Lottie files, at least, the early versions that you'd spit out using body movement or something like that.
Yeah.
Sometimes they were pretty large. It's like describing vectors using the super verbose, like you can open a Lottie file and it's just a text file with just tons and tons of stuff in it. And sometimes those things, and now there's tools that compress those because, there's like this sort of ecosystem around fixing that stuff. So what are some of the technical innovations that you're doing at Rive to solve problems that aren't as obvious to animators? Before Guido answers that, I want to make sure that you know about our in-depth motion design curriculum at School of Motion. We don't just offer classes that you can take anytime. We also offer interactive, guided sessions that go deep into teaching you how to use design and animation software, but more importantly, the principles of good design, animation, illustration, 3D, and much more. You get to learn alongside other artists, and you even get feedback and support from your own personal teaching assistant, a professional motion designer who's part of the School of Motion community. Find out more on our site. The link is in the description.
So I think that specific problem comes from the fact that the editor, After Effects, isn't built to export Lottie stuff. And so you can do a lot of stuff in After Effects that Lottie just can't process. And that's the unfortunate nature of it, that when it can't do that, and it's fortunate and unfortunate. In some ways, it's really smart, like what Hernan did. Hernan's the founder of Lottie, Body Movement initially. He sort of said like, okay, well, if I don't know, if someone used this crazy like bone system that After Effects, it's a plugin on top of After Effects, and the After Effects format has no concept of a bone, how am I going to get it to work at runtime? And so what he did was smart and gave you the option to still use bones, but basically the way it translates it to is that it basically bakes every single key in there. And that's why some Lottie files can get giant. And to the defense of the format, like if you sort of learn about that and really are aware of what it's doing, if you're an informed user, you can avoid that, and you just need to be aware of that. But a lot of people don't do that. They expect like, hey, what I'm building here, I would just want it to work, and they go and export it, and suddenly they realize, holy crap, this file is like 200 megabytes. And that's where, Rive instead has an advantage, is that because every single tool that we build, we build it first and foremost for the format, for how it's going to work at runtime. Our editor uses our runtime. So we're not going to build something and then figure out like, okay, this is how we want it to work in the editor. How are we going to make it work at runtime? No, those are the same problem. You're solving, in fact, it's less work because you're only building it once. And then in the editor, you're just manipulating the runtime format. I was going to say it sounds complicated, but I think it actually ends up being easier because you own the whole pipeline. So anyway, that's one example.
That was good because I think that, even things like parenting and stuff like that, where I'm assuming Lottie's having to do some fancy footwork to translate a parenting chain, and then there's a pre-comp, and these are concepts that don't really exist, and Lottie has to kind of hack them. Rive, you can just literally build the renderer.
And we give the designer, we try not to simplify that in the editor. So for example, a good example of this is shapes. A lot of design tools will simplify shapes for you. You draw a circle, and in your hierarchy, you see a circle, and that's it. But behind the scenes, you have a shape, and under it you have a path. And After Effects kind of exposes some of this. But you were talking about the transform spaces. But so instead, what we try to do is we give you the ability to we won't create a shape the way After Effects does and give you 1,000 properties on it. We'll create a shape, and then we'll tell you, do you want to add this property to it? Do you want to add another transform space on top of it? And that empowers the designer. Yeah, they got to learn a little more initially, because it's suddenly you draw a shape and whoa, where are all the properties for the shape? This looks like overly simplistic, but they're all there. And what that creates is a designer that really knows what they're doing. They're aware that okay, if I add this, I'm adding it because I need an extra transform space. I want this, this circle to, maybe it's a moon, and I want it to rotate from the center of this planet here, but then also be spinning on itself. So I know that I need 2 transform spaces there. But we're not going to give everything 2 transform spaces just because someone might need to do that. We were very purposeful about, no, the designer needs to decide that they want that there. And that means that the file is heavily optimized. It really only has the things that it needs. It's more like a game where everything comes at a cost at runtime. And we want you to think about that.
Yeah. So, and I know another big innovation, because you posted some pretty incredible demos while you guys are developing it. And I don't know if it's released yet or if it will be by the time this comes out, but the actually the render engine that Rive uses to actually display these things. And I don't know enough about how web browsers work. When a Lottie file is loaded and played, I don't know what renderer is actually rendering that.
Yeah.
But having used Lottie files on websites before, I know that sometimes they just stutter, and it's kind of hard to know why. And so I assume you've built Rive from the ground up to be performance. Maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah. So this, I can definitely speak to this. I want to caveat it with that I am not a rendering expert, so I'm gonna explain it the best I can. But my twin and co-founder, first of all, is our first rendering monster, and then we've had the fortunate of having hired 2 other engineers that are just exceptional rendering talents. That there's not a lot of people in the world that are working on solving vector graphics at the way the level these guys are. Especially for motion and for real-time animation, because there's plenty of vector renders that can draw super crisp text and make it look great for a static frame. But in motion, that's really hard. So when you're rendering something in a browser, usually you're using the browser's render engine, and a lot of people use Chrome, so a lot of people are using Skia, which is Google's rendering engine or renderer. And there's also, it gets more complicated because there's multiple things you can use. You can use Canvas 2D, which is not using WebGL, or you can use WebGL. And those are under the hood, they're still using Skia, but they come with certain different limitations, different powers and different features and all that. And so it can get complicated, which one do you use? For example, Canvas 2D is good. And I think Lottie might even give you an SVG render where it actually draws SVGs. But again, that's using Skia under the hood if you're using Chrome. And part of what's complicated with that is that those all have different feature sets. So some of them support blend modes, some of them don't support blend modes. Some of them support inner and outer strokes or dash strokes, and some of them don't. So what you're targeting becomes even more confusing when you're trying to render something and you're realizing, oh crap, it's not looking right. So that's part of the problem. The other part is, like you said, all these renders were never really built for motion. They do okay at it, but suddenly you start rendering 2 animations on the screen instead of 1, and you start seeing performance drops. So what we did is we knew for a long time that we needed to address that heavily. And this isn't just for the web, by the way. This is on Android and iOS too. This is on game engines. Game engines don't know how to render vector graphics. Everything is a triangle in a game engine.
Right.
And in fact, some of our hires, we negotiated hard to have them join us instead of Meta at the time, because Meta was trying to hire them to solve text in VR, because text in VR is a huge problem. So what we did, is we've been working on this for a long time, this concept of a very different type of way to render vector graphics. And we have, I think, some 5 patents on it. Some are still pending. I think I legally have to say that. But I want to be like clear, because a lot of people think like, oh, can you tell us what you did? How did you do this and all that? And it's like, it's a lot more fundamental than like a quick hack or a quick optimization. It is fundamentally a new way to render vector graphics that the team has come up with. And it's built specifically for our content. So that's a bit of a way that we cheat, in quotes. We don't care about, speeding up SVG, about speeding up all these archaic formats that we, don't care about. We care about Rive and how Rive needs to render. And so we can get rid of a lot of antiquated things, a lot of stuff that, we know we don't want to do. And you could make the Rive renderer work with SVG. There's actually not that many missing things. But the fact that we don't need to, we can just focus on our features, means that we can keep it tiny. So it's like, I think it's less than a megabyte. The renderer, I think it's hundreds of kilobytes. It used to, at one point, it used to be 100, and then we added text and some other stuff, and it got a little bigger. Actually, that's not true. That's not the renderer. That's the runtime. The render, one of the really brilliant things about Chris on our team, who joined us just over a year and a half ago now, he had like just breakthrough idea that like means that basically the way that text is rendered is the same as the way shapes are rendered. We don't have a specific rendering just for text, and that means that they can go really fast. Text can animate and do all kinds of things. So anyways, it's a very long way to say that we've developed this custom tech that is a very new type of renderer specifically for vector graphics, and it has a lot of advantages, and it accelerates our pipeline. It doesn't need new hardware, because it's not like it doesn't need web GPU and anything like modern hardware. It'll work fine with old Android phones, but it's taking us some time to implement it everywhere. That's really the part that we're still working on. So we just released it on Android and iOS. It's in a preview state, but a technical preview, but fully functional. And on the web, we're kind of waiting for this final piece, which is that there's an extension that Chrome has accepted. It's in Chrome, and Safari and Apple and Mozilla have also accepted, but it's not in the browsers yet. So every time they use Rive right now on the web, you're not seeing the Rive render. You're still seeing Skia effectively under the hood, at least on Chrome. But very soon you'll be seeing our render everywhere, and it's dramatic, the difference. Not only is it really crisp with text, and you can see text animate in a way that you probably haven't seen before, dynamic text, it's also just insanely fast. It can just fill the screen with vectors that you just couldn't do before.
Yeah, we'll, in the show notes for this, we're going to link to a bunch of examples that have been posted on Twitter and other places, because, there's one example I saw where it almost looked like a game that I guess was using the Rive render engine with like a guy shooting zombies.
Yeah, that was a demo we built because you could, we actually have a few customers building games with Rive, but we don't have any major game that's been launched with Rive, built entirely with Rive. But to prove the point, like we wanted to show, like, yes, there's a hole in game UI right now, and I think that's where we'll be solving a really big problem for people. Like everyone, from whether they're building a AAA 3D game to a 2D title, like everyone needs UI. So that's going to be something that will be, I think, known for, and people will be using Rive for. But there's no reason why you couldn't build a game entirely in Rive. All the 2D graphics can be built in Rive, and that's sort of what we wanted to show with that little demo. Was you haven't really seen a vector game that can just fill the screen with zombies like this, and it's all vector. You can zoom in and it remains perfectly crisp. You might not want to. You might not need to build a game where you can zoom in and see the vectors really crisp. And so we do support raster graphics too, and that would make it go even faster if you converted all of those to raster. You could have even more things happening on the screen. But the point is that, that was a demo to show just how much, because you almost can't do it with UI. You can't fill that much UI on the screen to make it go slow. And so we tried to do it with really rich characters with different clothes and different details. You'll see like there's things flapping in the wind. Everything is moving because everything can deform. Everything's a vertex, right, with a smooth curve. And the goal of that game was to show that.
That's so cool. So I wanted to ask you about this because, one of the things that was always a little bit clunky to me when I would animate in After Effects and then I would, export it to Lottie, is that, in After Effects, you're rendering individual frames. When it goes to Lottie, you're kind of doing that, but really it's more like time-based, and the renderer basically just tries to render everything as smoothly as it can, right?
Yep.
And so you end up doing these hacky things, animating at 60 just so you can kind of see sort of what it's going to look like.
Yeah.
One of the things I thought was so cool, you guys added this fairly recently, was, Rive can play the animation basically as fast as the renderer can create it. But you can actually make it like only render 12 frames a second.
That's right.
And stuff
that's
like
cool
that.
You caught that. Yeah. That's a very pro feature. I did that. I mean, that's awesome that you found that. Yeah.
Well, to be honest, that's one of those features where, I mean, to me, it kind of blew my mind, 'cause it never occurred to me to do it that way, because we animators love animating at 12 frames a second, right? You can get away with a lot more. It has that cool kind of handmade look to it. And I never see stuff on the web animated at 12. Probably because you just wouldn't think to. Maybe the technology wasn't there, it wasn't easy. And I'm curious how you sort of see the balance of maintaining some of these these conventions that animation has, like frames and a frame rate and aspect ratios even, Rive has a canvas. It works a little differently than like an After Effects composition. Do you still feel like you have to kind of have some of these legacy ideas in Rive? Or can you actually eventually just push past that? We don't need to think in terms of frames,
Yeah. So initially, we definitely felt that way. We felt like, we even have an option in the timeline called frames per second, but we had renamed it to, I think, oh gosh, I don't remember now. It's like interval or something like that. Because really in Rive, what it is like, it's the interval at which you're setting keys. And that's like, because we can't let you just drag on the timeline, infinitely dependent and just set a key, because you're going to accidentally be creating all these keys that are just like a smidge apart from one another, and they're not. So you need intervals to make sure that you're working in something that's graspable. So initially, we had a hard time helping people understand. No, that's not really frames per second. You're not. They're like, Mike, I'm changing this, but the animation is still crazy smooth. I want it to I don't want it to be this smooth. And we had to explain, all you're changing there is like the interval at which you can set the frames, but you're not rendering it differently. And that was something that we realized, by pushing past, like you're saying, pushing forward, we've actually taken away a creative constraint that was good. That was, great design is all about, I think, working within constraints, and that had become its own style. And so that's when we realized, we need to reintroduce this. And there's a smart way we can do it, which is, tell the renderer only to render that we call it quantized frames, render only the frames that you need. And it has two great effects. One is that it actually can save performance too, because it's only rendering the frames that you need, as opposed to trying to fill it with as much as you want. But then it also allows animators to really find it's another creative constraint that lets them, create a style that they might want. So I think we're always for finding the modern way and blowing past conventions. I think we're the team that will always be pushing for that. But when it comes to suddenly hampering creativity, we definitely don't want to do that. So this has kind of made me think of our graph editor, which is probably a longer conversation, but our graph editor is just a little bit different, and there's some things you need to learn about it, but there's a good reason there. And it's because it's similar to this. We wanted to give people a graph editor in a way to sort of make sure that they're creatively creating the stuff that they want, but at the same time, not suddenly blowing up their file sizes by, you don't realize it, but every time you move a Bezier curve and you move those handles, that's new data that you're adding to everything. And when you're not using like a function,
cubic Bezier,
exactly.
something like that.
Those are easy because those have those can be what's it called? They can be shared across. You could have 50 keys that are using that same thing, and that's just gets stored once. Suddenly, the chances that you drag those Bezier handles at exactly the right spot that you did with that other one, it gets a little harder. And so we have ideas on how to make that better too. But we also have this concept of you have to actually manually tell it, give me that cubic Bezier. Otherwise, we're not going to give it to you because you're going to accidentally go and blow up your file.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually really pleasantly surprised. So I just finished re-recording an animation class, and it's an After Effects class, but one of the lessons in it is I want to sort of prove the point that animation principles are universal. And so if you learn how to animate a ball bounce in After Effects, you could do it in Blender, you could do it doesn't matter. And I did it in Blender, and I did it in Rive. And I was really pleasantly surprised with the way the graph editor works, because it's very intuitive. Well, because I've used other tools that attempt to be animation tools that, sort of are aimed at doing product, UX animation. and none of them have a good graph editor, you know? And I think by good graph editor, I mean, I want the real thing. I want to be able to break the tangents and get it exactly right, you know? And so I think you do actually need that control, but it's cool that you figured out a way to give it to you when you need it and then take it away when you don't need it.
There's a lot of stuff like that. We want the designer to be in control and maybe learn a few new things that you didn't have to learn in other tools, but you know, it gives you more power if you're aware that that's going to change something at runtime for you, and you should be aware of that. By the way, the graph editor came directly from the partnership with Duolingo. That was something that the Gunner animators and the Duolingo animators for a long time had been talking to us about.
Yeah, that explains it. You know, I know those guys. I know some of the animators on the team. I mean, they're very like, those are animators. You know, they really they care about the graph editor and stuff. So you just mentioned like, and I think it's cool that, you know, animators can sort of learn other things and they're developing almost like a secondary skill set if they get deep into Rive. And I'm curious, like how far, I mean, you know, this might just be your opinion, but I'm curious, like how far do you think in this modern world of where motion design is spilling out of marketing and advertising, and now it's all over product, right? And, you know, when you're working with product teams and developers, you know, maybe you're working in Framer, maybe you're working in Webflow, maybe you're working with stuff from Figma, you know, which After Effects artists aren't quite used to using yet. How do you sort of envision, and I guess, you know, if you were sort of reading the tea leaves, a motion designer that's using Rive, what other sort of things should they kind of have a grasp on? Like, do you think it's like Framer plus Rive? Like, and maybe one way to approach this is I was talking earlier today with someone who was talking about the idea of like, what is the new generalist motion designer? It used to be a generalist is you design, you animate, you probably do some 3D.
Cool,
but maybe there's a new version where you use After Effects probably, but you use Rive, but also you can get into Framer and you can actually kind of connect your Rive, you know. So I'm curious how you think about that.
Yeah. So Framer is actually a really good example because they have a really cool way to build plugins for Framer, and that's what allowed us to build like this Rive plugin for Framer, where you basically copy some Rive code and you drop it. It's our runtime code. We generate the runtime code for you in a share link, and it's specifically built for Framer's plugin system. You copy that and you paste it into Framer, and it gives you the Rive object on the stage with the width and height. Like, you know, you were asking before about width and height. That's why width and height still is important. Like, we're never going to completely lose those things, because inside of products and in other things where when you're not using Rive as an entire, you know, app canvas or game canvas, but you're using it as, which is fundamental to Rive and something that will always be a part of Rive, is that, you know, you can build full experiences with it, but you can also build components for other runtimes where it can run in like a Framer or like a native iOS app. And Framer, it's a really cool example because not only does it let you like kind of position the Rive object the way that you do like an image or a Lottie file or anything like that, but it then lets you kind of, in the inspector in Framer, it surfaces all of the state machine's inputs. And so then you can tie it into Framer's state machine, because Framer does have a state machine. It's not presented as a classic visual state machine. They have their components. I think they call them variations.
Variants, yeah.
Or variants. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And you can basically have, you know, a variant that has its kind of default state, and then it has the hovered state, and then it has, that's a state machine. And you can tie Rive's state machine to those different things. You can say like, oh, when it's on hover, set, you know, this input on the state machine to 20, set this Boolean to true, you know, do all these things. And that kind of controls the Rive state machine. And let's do it. So I think really the thing that designers and animators are learning, and the kind of the next step of motion in general, regardless of whether it's Rive, is this kind of state-based concept. And I think that carries across all these other design tools. And we're just being very, very direct about not trying to simplify it and put it into a thing that designers are used to, and saying, no, go and learn what this is. This is cool. This is like, we want to give you the full control of a state machine. And that's where I think with Rive, you end up being able to just create stuff that there's no like concept of hovered, for example, or pressed or disabled. You build something, you create like, you know, a checkbox and say, this is my hovered, true or false. And then you choose, you can have 5,000 things happen if you want on hover, or you can have only one thing happen. But you remain in control of that.
Right. And it's a two-way street, right? So like, you know, the state machine of your Rive file can be manipulated by the Framer site, but also vice versa, right? Like if you click your Rive
That's
object,
right.
it can send a command out too.
So we just added that functionality. Yeah, we added this feature called events in Rive, where if something, so it used to be that you had to do some tricky stuff and like detect, oh, the state changed in Rive. Now I can, basically call something at runtime in framers, like some JavaScript code, and have it do something. Now we have this concept of events, which I don't know if we've exposed to Framer yet. This would have to be something that one of our dev roles could explain. But people that are just using native like React and are just like the web stuff without a visual editor, just like kind of React on its own. There's now this concept of an event that you can fire in a Rive animation, and it can happen in a lot of different cases. So like one example, I'm going to go back to the character one because I always go to characters, but there's like UI stuff too. Like character, for example, you can have a character that's walking and it's a left foot touched, right foot touched, right? And you can, on the timeline, you can put like this event saying fire left foot, fire right foot. And then at runtime, you can say like every time it touches, a footstep happens, here's like a folder of footstep sounds, randomly pick from one of them and modulate the volume or something like that. And so that's one example. But you can also say like, when this state changed, like it went to disabled or something like that, fire an event and tell my runtime code, hey, the button is now disabled. And that might cause like a pop-up to happen in Framer or something else. And so yeah, point is, it's this concept of like being able to tell external code something happened and tie an event to it or tie some code to it. And it can be audio, it can be, vibrate my phone. It can be run some code that does something else that hits a service in the back end. But it like you said, it's a two-way street.
Yeah, I mean, this is the part of Rive that really gets me excited because it kind of opens up like a part of your brain that you haven't really been able to use, in the sort of traditional linear world of motion. Even if you're just animating like a map pin, like that's going to be in a map app, but like when you click the top of it, it's supposed to like, ping the GPS satellites and do some crazy thing. You don't need to know how any of that works. You can just tell it, hey, when the user clicks this, send the top of the pin clicked event.
That's right.
Tell the developer that's what it's called. They can
right.
do the rest. And so now it just becomes this like, I can't think of a better word. It sounds pretentious, but the lingua franca, it's like now I can just tell you the name of the event I made.
Yeah.
And you can do the rest, but we can talk about, and you can tell me, before that event, I need you to do this other thing. And it just makes it so much easier to talk to developers.
Yeah, totally. We call it, Duolingo has a better word for something. Let's see if I can remember it. But we always say that it's like the handshake or no, we say it's the contract between designers and developers. But I think Duolingo is saying handshake. And it's true. It's like the development team doesn't need to know that it's a pin. Heck, on the design side, you might not want it to be a pin someday. You might want to change it completely and make it something different. All the dev team needs to know is like, did this thing happen? And that's where you talk to them. What do we label this thing? Because you're going to be expecting this label coming to you. What do you want me to label it? And that's sort of where the kind of this integration happens. But once you've set up that contract, like you say, hey, top of pin was touched, or loading started, and this percentage of loading has happened. You can then change your state machine and change everything within that. And provided that those contracts or those handshake points stay the same, like, it's still going to work. You can drag and drop that image or that Rive file into your app and swap it out, and everything will still work. You can change it. You can change a 5-star rating to like a house that's I don't know, like a bar that's on fire and that's going sliding from 0 to 100.
Right.
And provided that those contracts are still in place, your devs don't need to know that anything changed. You just swap that out.
Yeah, it seems like version control and versioning is going to be a lot easier using something like this. I want to dig into the Duolingo, use case a little bit, because that's the most high profile one I've heard of. Although you mentioned Figma's doing some stuff with it, but the Duolingo one is just such an obvious example, right? To motion designers, and if anyone's listening, you haven't used Duolingo, it's an app that teaches you other languages, but it's done in this really clever way, and there's a ton of like really good design and animation, and there's little characters that react to things. And, so we talked a little bit about it, but I'm curious, like maybe you just tell the story of like how that relationship started. Why did they pick Rive? What does Rive let them do that they couldn't do otherwise?
Sure. Yeah. So if I remember right, it was really early. They discovered us crazy early. I think we had maybe just gone to public beta. We had just added the state machine, and it was, I think, the founder, Severin Hacker, that reached out to us, who's also the CTO over there. And I think Kurt, the animator who did, I'm not going to say his last name right. It starts with an H, Hatterfield, maybe. I'm not so sure if I'm pronouncing it right. But the two of them, I think, were the first two to reach out. And they asked us to sort of present it to the whole team because they had some ideas and they were really interested initially in sort of like saving on file size and some performance stuff that they were running into. And so in like that first meeting where we pitched them on stuff, we started showing them the state machine. We just saw them light up, and it completely changed from like, oh, this is a really interesting tool that's going to help us optimize things, to, wow, we can do things that we didn't even realize we could do. And they came back after that first meeting and started immediately, like we created a Slack together right then, like on the spot during that call, like connected the Slack teams together and started like kind of going back and forth. And it like immediately after that meeting, they started talking about lip syncing. They were like, oh, we can finally do lip syncing with this. Like the state machine was sort of the aha moment for them of like, this is going to let us do all this stuff that they hadn't even like, I don't even think we'd put the state machine on our website yet as a feature. Like no one like knew that existed. And they went full bore into it right away. And so Kurt immediately like rebuilt the duo animation, duo walking, which you used to see in the older version of the app. Now they've gone all out. They have newer versions of it, but that classic one you used to always see, where he's kind of walking and it's loading. And to sort of just do the kind of proof of concept of that first point, can we get the file size down compared to what we're seeing before from what we're exporting out of After Effects? And that was immediately like, holy crap, this is like, I don't know, it was like 16 kilobytes compared to like, some 260 or something that they were seeing. So they were like, wow, but we were so happy because they weren't focusing on that. They were focusing on, look at all this cool stuff we can do that suddenly we never envisioned being able to do, or we thought was going to be really complicated to do at scale. And so, that was when the whole lip syncing thing started. We started speaking to their, linguistics experts and learning about visemes and helping them, like showing them, teaching them how to use the state machine and how it might be set up in a way that would support the features that they were trying to do. And they had it working like within a week. It was crazy. Like there's some very smart people there. Not only did it like look great from the animation side, but all the technical stuff was like work. And then it was more about figuring out like, okay, how do we scale this up to all the different characters? And we were working on this nested artboards feature, which is kind of like components or pre-comps in After Effects, but lets you kind of see them all on the same stage next to each other. And then they started like sharing facial features and stuff like that so that they could use the mouths, like reuse parts of the mouths for different characters so that they didn't have to like, so it could scale the lip syncing stuff across multiple characters. So anyway, that was, I would guess about more than 2 years ago, maybe. And so they've seen the product really evolve and they've been using it from very early days. And it's been an awesome relationship with those guys. And they've informed the product a lot, obviously. Like the graph editor was built very much in collaboration with their team.
Yeah, I was going to ask, I assume that having, a customer like that, obviously that's a huge get for any startup to get a big, a really cool brand too. Like, not just that they're big and that means they could pay you, hypothetically, but also like they're doing really cool stuff. It's a great use case. And I imagine that having a customer like that, that's going to push a lot of the, the feature requests and things like that. I'm curious what other, and I don't know what you can reveal here, but like what other kinds of things are they asking for? Like what else do they want Rive to be able to do that it will be able to do one day?
So without going into too many details, there's a lot about scale, right? They're a big team. So how do we do things that scale? There's some things you might have seen recently that launched that we can talk about, like that. We launched like a tagging system that they have. So you're asking about like how are motion designers going to evolve and new things that they might learn. Like we're already seeing in Duolingo that there's certain skills that are being formed as different roles within Duolingo. And there's sort of like this animator role, which obviously like really gets animation really well, can build awesome characters. But there's also like this concept of a technical rigger that has always kind of existed for games, but now is becoming like a Rive thing, like technical rigging. And then there's like the technical state machine person. I don't know that they have like a name for it, but or a title yet. But it's like this concept of like a technical artist that like really specializes on the state machine. And so because they have these different people with different level of experience in certain parts of Rive, one of the things they were finding was that they really wanted to be able to say like, I only want to see this part of the hierarchy. Like I only want to see like if I'm an animator, don't show me all the bones and all the rig stuff. I just show me like the control points. And so we added this tagging system that lets them filter the hierarchy, and they can have multiple ones, and they can lock certain things so that you're certain that you're only touching the things you want to be touching. And so yeah, that was the feature that was recently released that came also from that relationship with them, where it just made it much easier to work together simultaneously on the same file with a bunch of people, and knowing that you're not like touching something that, is going to mess up what someone else is working on.
Right. So, okay. So those are more, sort of workflow features, which is kind of cool. I mean, that's cool that's the kind of stuff they're asking for, because it means that they're really like, they're using it a lot, and they're trying to like save time and stuff.
No, I missed a really important one, actually. So Luigi and I had built joysticks as a feature that is not workflow, really. It's more like fun kind of motion design stuff.
Yeah, joysticks and sliders. Everyone listening to this knows what that is. Yeah,
we had built it before, like a long time ago, in another product that we were our little character animator thing, and we had never gotten it back into Rive, because when we started, building Rive from the ground up purposely for all this, it was just one of those things that and Jelly Bones never have made it back in. Jelly Bones is something else we can get to some other point, but it's
yeah.
like
I'm going to need to know what that is.
Yeah, you can imagine, very descriptive name. And so joysticks was something that came out very, very directly from their team too. I think we were like hanging out after. We were in person in Pittsburgh, and I think we're with Alex Chop on their team, who's you've probably seen him in some of the recent Duolingo videos. And for fun, we kind of just showed him like, oh, check out this joysticks feature that we always thought was really cool. And he kind of went, oh my God, is this working? Why can't I get my hands on it? And it wasn't like, no, this is the old prototype of the tool. It's not actually functional. And so that was something that we then worked with them. We got the first version out and iterated a bit, and they gave us some feedback, and yeah, made it into the product because of them and their excitement around it. And I think that was really interesting, because that was like, yeah, you said joysticks and sliders, something that animators are kind of familiar with, but not in the sense of like, oh, you can also tie it to like runtime functionality, like tracking the mouse cursor or other inputs in the state machine that manipulate it. And so there's this like concept of, yeah, you can animate it to create really rich characters with simple control points, but then you can also tie certain like interactive and runtime features to it. And I think that was something really unique that came out of that partnership with them.
Yeah, and just to try to paint a picture for people listening to this and thinking, well, give me an example. Like, the obvious one that I've seen is, the character's eyes can follow the mouse pointer, stuff like that. But you can also, the closer the mouse gets to the character, something else happens. And then when it's within a certain range, and all of these things can be controlled, and you layer that with the state machines, it's really kind of crazy how powerful it is right now. I'm curious, so, looking at the future, I'm an After Effects artist. That's how I was raised, basically. So there's a lot of things that Rive can't currently do, and I'm curious if like for example, there's no blur feature, right?
Yes.
And things like that.
One of our most requested features.
I'm sure. Yeah. Now, are there technical limitations based on the fact that this is a runtime tool? It has to be able to play in real time, and some of these things, displacement maps and blurs and things like that, warping. Are those things that technically you can do it, it's just on the roadmap, or are there things that just by the nature of it may not be possible until hardware is better or something? Yeah,
no, so we will do them. The main reason we haven't done blurs specifically, I can get to the other things like displacement maps and all that. That's an easier answer. Just nothing support, no runtime like format that we currently supports them. But like you say, like blurs, give me like. iOS has blurs, Android has blurs, the web has blurs. Now, why can't you give me blurs?
Right.
And part of the problem with blurs is that, number one, they're a little different everywhere. So like if you look at a blur on one platform versus another, different renders, they're not exactly the same. And so we can't, we try to make it so that what you design in Rive, is going to look the same. It's going to work at runtime. That's one of our core benefits of and this is why we're building our own render, is that now we can guarantee that if when we make our blur, number one, it will look the same, but number two, it'll also perform the same and be performing. Because right now you can quickly get into a world where you kill your performance with those type of effects. And if it's not done in a way where you're thoughtful about it, you might find like, oh, it's working really well in the editor, but then on my website, it's really slow. And like, yeah, you've added like 50 blurs to do all these highlight edge glows and like lighting effects and then drop shadows and all of that. Like when you nest it together, like kills, like it takes a lot of performance. And then in the editor you're seeing it by itself, but maybe on a website you're seeing it with a ton of other content mixed in, and so you quickly can get into a world where you make a mess. So step one is get our renderer working everywhere. Once our renderer is implemented everywhere, then we will make our version of Blur. And we have really strong opinionated ideas about how to do that. And it'll work performantly and it'll be everywhere. And it won't let you in the editor do things where it's just going to kill it. Like we'll flat out have things that tell you like, hey, you're going to do something here that is potentially recursive or is like blurring a blur on top of another blur. And it just gets really messy. So that's blurs. But there's other features like inner and outer stroke, for example, is something that we don't even have yet. And a lot of people ask us like, you're a design tool, come on, how can you not have inner and outer stroke? And the part of that is that, like, again, that's not handled the same across all of those different renderers, and some of them don't support it. And so we would rather, instead of giving you something that can work, and we can build a hacky way to make it look consistent on other ways and detect, oh, you're on iOS, so you got to do it this way and all that.
Right.
We'd much rather say, we're not going to waste time on a hacky solution. We're going to build the proper way, which is once we have our render, make sure that our render, builds dash strokes, inner and outer strokes, and all that type of stuff. So that's a quick answer to that. Like, it really is just waiting for the render to be integrated across the entire pipeline, across all our runtimes, and then you'll start seeing blurs, drop shadows, all kinds, bloom effects, and that type of stuff. Then on the other side, like the displacement mapping and all that, like there's just very few tools have maybe Apple might have a concept of like a displacement map or something. But if you're going to a runtime like that, like those things just don't exist. And so we will build our feature set for that type of stuff. And we're debating right now whether it comes as part of like a plugin that you can build yourself for Rive. We definitely will have some kind of plugin scripting system, because I think that's fundamental to a tool like this, is enable big teams to build their own features is like really core. But also, we will also give you some kind of VFX thing in Rive, and we haven't quite decided yet if it'll be more like some that we want to kind of control ourselves and make sure that we're building them in a way that is going to be really performant and work really well, or if it's going to be purely like a plugin kind of system or external like kind of shader type thing. Although I don't want to talk about that because that's where my like knowledge is really
getting
limited.
Out over your skis a little bit there.
And our rendering folks might, I know they've talked a lot about, things that people have done very poorly with shaders in the past that we don't want to repeat.
Yeah. And I'm thinking of things that After Effects is good at. And it's funny, like I even remember back when Flash was still a thing, some of my first freelance gigs were like, keying out characters, keying out actors like on a green screen, and then putting them on a background the same color as the website they were going to go on. Yeah. And then the Flash artist would like make when they do this, a button would appear. And, are you thinking along those lines too, maybe like video features and I don't know if you need compositing features, but how far are you thinking of taking it?
Yeah. So video is one that we've talked a bit about, and it's been tabled probably more than anything else right now, just because we have a way to do it, but it quickly becomes complicated. It's a little outside my expertise, but I think there's concerns about file size and having to bring like a decompressor into the runtime and all that stuff, which most tools already have, and you don't, you're kind of so I think there's some technical things we need to figure out there, but it's definitely all feasible. It's doable. And also we've had one of the requests we've had a lot from customers is just the ability to even just not even use video for runtime, but be able to load it in the editor to be able to do like, what's it called? References from videos for animating.
Right,
That's I think a use case that's more likely is to come sooner.
Well, let me ask you about this too. So, I was basically just wondering like how, there's things that After Effects is really, really good at. And maybe Rive is just never like meant to replace some of those things, right? Like I can't imagine it being a hardcore compositing tool where you're match moving shots and all that.
Yeah.
However, it is useful to have like a concept of 2.5D layers and stuff like that. Are you thinking of expanding right now? Rive is a fully 2D app.
Yeah.
Would you ever consider like expanding that? Obviously, there's technical hurdles there, but just from a
we've talked about it. Yeah, there's no reason not to. We definitely can. And we've talked to customers about it too. There's no limitation on that. We can definitely go 2.5. 2.5D is likely to be something that is very doable. That especially when we have our own render. But then like full 3D, a little more effort, but yeah, also not outside the scope of what the team is capable of. It's that we've definitely talked about like all the things that we build aren't necessarily just tied to 2D. We're already being thoughtful with that. But are you going to see 3D in Rive anytime soon? Probably not. I think the reverse is true, where there's a lot of tools that do 3D really well, and you might see Rive become the vector solution or the 2D solution for those tools, like we're doing with game engines right now, like we might do with some of the other 3D platforms that are emerging right now. I think that would be probably a better use of our effort rather than trying to, potentially compete with anything like that. But yeah, to your point, like we're not going to be the tool that you use to remove, the wires that are suspending Neo while he's dodging bullets. That's just not what Rive is ever going to be about. We are, the fundamental use case for Rive is interactivity. And that's, runtime. It's graphics that have to run in software. And that's anything in that world. I think you'll see us innovate a lot on. One thing we haven't talked about that Luigi and I have built a lot of in our past has been particle systems. We built so many particle systems in the past, and those typically tend to be things that get, included as an add-on to an app or like a plugin. And we have very opinionated ideas about how to make the best 2D particle system you've ever seen with the insane rendering, tech that we have. So that could be something like pretty novel that we do over the next year or two, depending on how things shape up here. But that's an example of something that I think we have a lot more to give to the tool still.
Yeah, I love it. All right, I've only got two more questions. You've been really generous with your time, Guido. So I wanted to ask you about two hires you just made. We mentioned them briefly, but so you hired Jerry Liu.
Yes.
Really great designer animator, and you hired I don't want to say his name wrong, but it's like Hernan Teresi?
Yeah,
Hernan,
Teresi,
okay.
Yeah.
Hernan, who's the founder. And it's interesting because I'd actually never heard his name before, but when I looked, he's the body moving guy.
Yeah. And
I didn't realize he was the founder of Lottie.
Yeah. So Hernan made Body Movin', which was this plugin for After Effects that let you export the After Effects format as JSON. And then he also made the Body Movin' web player. And then at some point, I think Airbnb got involved, saw it, and was like, we want to build like these iOS and Android runtimes for it too, in players. And they also rebranded it to Lottie. So I think the actual name Lottie came from the Airbnb branding side of things. But it was all, based on Hernan's open source work that he had built. So he founded the whole movement and the whole idea of it, and the whole tech that it's still based on today. It's now there's other tools that export Lotties, but it was initially Body Movin'. It was a thing that he invented. That hasn't changed over the years.
Exactly.
And so we've been working with him for a while. We first started working back in 2019, when it was still sort of the prototype that Luigi and I had built. We landed a pretty big customer that I can say now because they're unfortunately kaput. It was Stadia. So Stadia was looking at using Rive for all their players and systems. And they had just a lot of After Effects animations that they had already built. And they were like, we can't like go back and rebuild, 60 animations here. They had characters and all kinds of things. And so they saw all the benefits of Rive, and they wanted to use, at the time I think we might have just rebranded Rive, but it was still like our prototype that was called Flare. We had two tools. One was called Nima, which was a character animation tool, and the other one was Flare, which was closer to what Rive is today. So they were using it, and they basically asked us like, hey, we need to import all this After Effects. We just can't start from scratch. We love your tool. We want to use it for everything. And we're already building stuff, but what do we do in the meantime? And so we just reached out to Hernan, and I think he might have already, I'm trying to remember now, we might have already been talking or something about it separately, but we sort of said like, hey, would you be interested in helping us figure out how to convert, the JSON format that you're exporting from After Effects to basically help these guys out? I think there's going to be a lot of folks that are going to kind of need help transitioning. And he was stoked. He like loved the project. He basically saw it as like, this is what I wanted it to be, but I was limited by what After Effects can do. And so he immediately, like, it resonated with him. We immediately started talking. He was also a great guy. Like, we got along super well together. He built this integration for us immediately. Like, I think Body Movin' to this day has an export to Rive button on it. Wow. And at the time it was called Flare, export to Flare, and then it became Rive. It's just been a great relationship with him. We immediately started saying like, we should be working together, Hernan. Like, why don't you come out here? And he had some reasons why he couldn't at the time. And for one reason or another, it kept not happening because of different things he had going on personally, and then with the company he was working with, which he was obviously loyal to and didn't want to just abandon them. And so, yeah, finally, this year it happened to line up in a way where, he pinged us and said, guys, I'm finally ready. I'm at a spot where I can stop what I'm doing now and I can join you. And so we were like, hell yes, here's your offer, within, I don't know, a couple hours.
That's so cool. And then you brought on Jerry Liu also. And I want to point out too, and I'm not trying to like throw shade at anybody, but a lot of the bigger companies that make software for artists don't actually employ many artists on the team that's building the app, which is always kind of strange
that you're
to
bringing
me.
this up.
Yeah. So maybe you could talk about, bringing on Jerry and kind of what your maybe what your ethos is and why you're doing things like
Our
this.
team is split in two. So we like to talk about the fact that, founder designer, founder engineer. Like we like to talk about the fact that design and engineering are twin competencies. And so there isn't this sense of the design team and the engineering team at Rive, but there is a sense of a product team and the creative team. And the product team are a mix of designers and devs that build the product. And then the creative team are a mixture of developers and designers and animators and motion graphics folks that use the tool. They're sort of our first users. So they try out things, they give feedback to the product team about like what works, what doesn't work. They sort of use the daily builds that are super broken, but super experimental, but like starting to see like, ooh, this is what this text feature is going to look like in a year when it's out. And on top of it, they also, they maintain stuff like our tutorials. They do a lot of our branding, a lot of our documentation, the community. They're very active on Discord and Twitter. So yeah, it is fundamentally a very, very how can I say it? Purposeful way that the company was built. JC was, I think, the first. Juan Carlos, you might have seen him on Twitter. He's Hello JC Toon. He's always posting some of the most cool Rive stuff you've probably seen. And he was like the first person that Luigi and I started working with. We also hired an engineer a little bit later, but he was the first. Well, actually, we hired an engineer full time. So technically, the engineer that joined me and Luigi was the first full time hire. But JC was like our first other member of Rive, even though he couldn't work full time for us at the time. So he was kind of part time. And we just found him on the website. He had posted something that he built with Rive, and we were like, holy crap, we have a real animator. It was like this fly that was kind of bouncing and jiggling and like looked great. And we were like, whoa, someone made something really cool. And so, and we had always, from that moment, we had said like, we need someone like that on the team that like, cause I'm an animator and I do, but I'm fundamentally like a UI designer. That's what I've always done. I'm not a character animator. And so I do a lot of like UI motion graphics. And so the fact that we had something like that, we said, we need that to be a core part of the team. And yeah, you can kind of see where this is going with Jerry. At the time, I think we were all very aware of Jerry and seeing his work and saying like, holy crap. You might have seen I posted on Twitter some of the Slack convos from 2016, 2017, as early as that, saying like, holy crap, this guy's work is insane. Like, and so we've always been huge fans, and it was a big kind of yes moment for us. And we started talking to him, and yeah, it made total sense.
That's awesome. And do you look at that almost as like a marketing strategy too? I mean, you're building things with the product, and then, the animators working on it or posting it, and then it sort of spreads. I mean, are you also doing sort of traditional marketing to get users?
So that's, great point. We have just made also with these two hires, our first marketing hire. We hired Sarah Warren, who's our first, she's heading up all marketing and growth at Rive. And she comes from, a lot more of like that traditional marketing background. But up until now, and what we will keep as well with Sarah's very like on board and of the same opinion, is like what's worked really well for Rive is that it's authentic to who, we are all as members of the team. We're all designers and devs. We are, we don't like being marketed to, we don't like being sold to. And so we always want it to feel very authentic and not fluffy, which I think, other tools in the past have like failed when they grew really big and they started doing all this fluffy marketing. I won't name names. And you don't hear about them anymore because of that.
Right.
And so we're very, very aware of that. And yeah, it totally is. I wouldn't say it was like intentional, like let's make this our marketing plan. But we realized as we were doing it, like, oh, this is a much better way to do this. And it felt really good. And so now we've pinpointed that and realized like this should be our marketing plan and that's how it's been working. Like, we don't have any outbound sales or anything like that. Like Duolingo happened and some of the other companies that we're working with, because a few champions within Duolingo started using it and we're like, holy crap, this is cool. They started trying it a bit themselves. And then after a bit, like said, we need to reach out to these guys and ask them if they can do a demo for the whole company. Let's bring our CTO and like see if we can get it approved. And that's been the playbook that has happened organically with like every single enterprise customer that we've landed. It's just been someone that started using it and did some little hackathon within their team and then came and said like, okay, we gotta get a bigger, plan for the whole team here.
Yeah, that's outstanding. Well, dude, this has been really awesome. My last question is, I want you to kind of, paint the picture for everyone listening to this. What over the next 5-10 years, I really think that the work motion designers are doing is some of it'll stay the same. There's gonna be a lot of new opportunities out there.
Yeah.
It's funny, like one of the things that popped into my head just now was, thinking about game UI, sort of the user, like the start screen design and animation, all that. That's not something I ever thought, oh, I could go do that because that's the development thing. And now I'm like, oh, actually, yeah, like animators can do that. Yeah. There used to be one of my favorite apps that used to be DVD Studio Pro, if anyone, anyone remembers that. Yeah. Because you could get really clever with it and you could make these sort of animated interactive things. And, so I'm thinking about like, streaming platforms all have interfaces and, when you rent a movie from Apple, like, they have these custom things and all that.
We're talking to a few, yeah.
Exactly. So maybe you can just kind of paint the picture of like, what are all the use cases that you'd like to see Rive used for? What are the problems? What are the problems that exist now that hopefully won't exist anymore because Rive solved them?
We really see it as anything that has a screen and that can have a designer build an interface for it. Like that has an opportunity to not be some templated, car UI that every single car has, and instead a really branded, unique thing that, has good usability principles behind it as well, but also doesn't need to feel like everything else. And that could be car dashboards, any vehicle dashboard. We're talking to companies that are building different types of vehicles too. You might have seen that like a yacht UI that we posted recently. That was all built in Rive.
That's cool.
There's you mentioned games. I also think like the web in general is still like, I think probably market size wise one of the biggest things that people interact with day to day. And so I think we'll start seeing just like kind of some more, and this isn't just Rive, by the way, this is other tools that are working on this, like Webflow and Framer and Spline and a bunch of stuff that like
love
I think
Spline.
is gonna push like web experiences to just be different. And I think we'll start seeing like really unique and creative web experiences that you just can't like really imagine today, that are maybe a blend of games, but also just like really like unique things that aren't just a scrolling page, that have different, you can imagine some of the old Flash websites, like, not every site.
Too advanced, man.
Yeah, too
that
advanced.
Was the peak. Yeah.
Like there was also like movies, right? Used to have like really unique and cool websites. And I think that didn't Bjork have like a really cool Flash website that like musicians, like people like that want to just have something really creative. I think we'll start seeing a lot more of that. But yeah, so our hypothesis is that obviously motion is going to become a much bigger part of everything. But again, it's not just motion. It's also just interaction, like you were getting at. Like you could use Rive entirely for using very limited motion and just using it as a tool to build interactive content in a way that makes sense to a designer and is actually like looked positively upon by a developer, and says, devs are some of our biggest champions that say like, hey, I don't want you to give me any other format. Don't give me, a button like that. Give me a Rive, file. Yeah, I think that's some of the opportunities that are going to present themselves to motion designers, where you can suddenly, build stuff on platforms that you never thought you'd be able to ship to.
So, what do you think about Rive? Have you tried it? Leave a comment or hit us up on social media at School of Motion, and make sure to give Rive a look. You can find it at rive.app. And you can try out the entire app for free, so there's no excuse if you're curious about it. I really want to thank Guido and the entire Rive team for bringing this app to life and for sharing so much information about the roadmap for Rive, about really cool use cases that exist now, and that will likely exist in the next few years. I think this kind of tool solves a huge problem, and I'm super bullish on Rive, which you can probably tell. That's it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. Later.